Hi, everybody. Welcome, everyone, to the launch of two reports by API Data, one of them in collaboration with the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. This is Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and we're so thrilled to be joined today by the chair of the Congressional APA Caucus, Congresswoman Judy Chu. Congresswoman Chu, so glad that you could join us today. Would love to hear some of your thoughts about why data is so essential for our communities.
Well, hello. Thank you for inviting me to this very important event. Yes, I'm Congressmember Judy Chu, chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call CAPAC, which advocates on behalf of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities in Congress. Thank you all for joining today's launch of the National Data Equity Report, a joint effort by AAPI Data and the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, or NCAPA. Increasing access to data on the AANHPI community, especially disaggregated data, is at the core of so much of the work that CAPAC does. So I'm thrilled that this report is being released today, especially during Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. The AANHPI community is remarkably diverse and composed of over 50 racial subpopulations that speak over 100 languages. And each community has a unique story and unique needs. It's impossible to fully understand the AANHPI experience without taking this diversity into account. Unfortunately, we often see AANHPIs lumped together in data sets, broken down by racial demographics, or excluded entirely. This not only erases our community's experiences, but it also limits the ability of policymakers and elected officials to tailor policies to the needs of individual AANHPI communities. It also curtails the ability of AANHPI organizations to provide direct services to communities in need or effectively advocate on their behalf. From pressing the Census Bureau to collect and produce data that's disaggregated as much as possible for our communities, to advocating for the collection of disaggregated data by all government agencies, increasing data equity has been a cornerstone of my work as CAPAC chair. In fact, just a few months ago, CAPAC's leadership met with President Biden, Vice President Harris, and a number of senior advisors at the White House, where we discussed how important the need for data equity is for our communities. And it was just the time to meet, because just last month we got truly exciting news on this front. After years of CAPAC and community organizations like AAPI Data using this data and asking the Office of Management and Budget to update their data disaggregation standards to better meet the needs of our community, President Biden's Equitable Data Working Group submitted recommendations to OMB that includes a revision of the 1997 current federal minimum data standards. And specifically, it cites a need for disaggregated data for AANHPI communities. This is a major win for our community, one that is in line with both CAPAC's recommendations to the Equitable Data Working Group and the recommendations outlined in the report that AAPI Data is launching this morning. We in CAPAC will continue to work with our partners in OMB and at the White House as guidance on this revision is being developed. And on many of the recommendations put forth in the National Data Equity Report, like the need for agencies to prioritize timeliness between completion of data collection and reporting data back to community, CAPAC is actively advocating for these same things. And I'm proud to have organizations like AAPI Data and CAPA and so many others as partners in this work. For example, just last month, CAPAC members met with Census Bureau Director Robert Santos. We pressed him on the need for a timeline for the release of census data files that are crucial to our communities, including disaggregated population tables and the detailed demographic and housing characteristics, or DDHC files. While their delays are significant, he heard our message, which was, we want this information so that our communities can use it. It needs to be disseminated as soon as possible. So thank you, AAPI Data, for authoring this incredible report. What a timely release, especially during Asian Pacific Heritage Month. I truly appreciate that the deep partnership that KPAC has with AAPI Data and CAPA and so many other organizations who are at the forefront of advocating for data equity for our communities. Congratulations again on the launch of this important report, and happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month.
I was on mute. Okay. I was just
talking. Oh, no
wonder. Well, Congresswoman Chu, thank you so much for your leadership and for the leadership of all of the members and the staff of KPAC. You've been such tremendous champions, and it takes a village to do this work. As we say at API Data, data is an important part of it, but we have a framework that we call DNA, which is data, narrative, and action. The community narratives are so important, and the calls to action, and you've just been tremendous allies to make sure that not only do we collect the data, but we prioritize releasing the data, and to do so in a way that is user-friendly, community-friendly, and really drives the kinds of investments we know that our communities need. And without timely access to that data, it's going to be really difficult to get it done. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Great. So next, I'm going to share key findings from two reports that we're releasing later today. The first is a report on data equity that builds upon key recommendations from the Biden administration. These are recommendations from the Equitable Data Working Group that were released last month. And then I'm going to be joined by my colleague, Howard Shi, who's going to be presenting some key findings from our demographic report that is also being released later this afternoon. So hopefully the tech here works. So I will present. Okay. I'm going to presume I'll get a message if for some reason the tech is not working. So thank you once again for joining us today. What I'll do first, I'm Karthik Ramakrishnan. I'm the founder and co-director, along with Professor Janelle Wong of AAPI Data, and I'm thrilled to also be joined today by our managing director, Howard Shi, as well as Ryan Vin, who's backstage, who did tremendous work for the reports that we are launching today. Later, we'll also be joined by Greg Orton, who is the national director of the National Coalition of Asian Pacific Americans, who's been a tremendous ally in this work, as well as Erica Moritsugu from the White House. So just to lay out what we have in our report that we're releasing today, which is titled the 2022 Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Roadmap for Data Equity in Federal Agencies. That is a lot of words there. We do have a short title that you'll find in our report as well. So what does this report do? First, it provides an overview of prior reports and activities that have been conducted by community organizations, federal agencies, and advisory commissions pertaining to data equity as it involves Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. This history is really important because what we're seeing today is the result of years, if not decades, of work, and often with our community organizations, many of them and CAPA coalition members at the forefront of advancing data equity. We then provide a landscape scan of current measures taken by federal agencies to ensure data equity for our communities, with a particular focus on data disaggregation, language support, data collection, data analysis, And then finally, data dissemination and accessibility. Finally, we end with a series of recommendations to achieve data equity for our communities, including best practices and guidelines along our framework of DNA, data, narrative, and action, as well as our plans for ongoing engagement with federal agencies on data equity. In terms of the history of community efforts and government efforts, it is important to pay attention to the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget is important for several reasons, most notably with developing the federal budget and ensuring its implementation. But it also helps establish standards, including data standards that cut across federal agencies. The first major step by OMB on race and ethnicity data categories was in 1977, when it established Asian and Pacific Islander as the minimum standard for data collection and reporting. It did have Asian and Pacific Islander as one racial category. That was a significant improvement over prior efforts where in prior censuses, the Census Bureau reported out data for a small number of Asian groups, such as Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, but did not establish a racial category. Subsequently, in 1997, and after significant mobilization by Native Hawaiian populations and community groups, as well as Pacific Islander groups, the Census Bureau split Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, the way they termed it, as a separate racial category and allowed for multiple race responses for the first time for all Americans. Finally, in 2016, the Obama administration, in September of that year, the Office of Management and Budget proposed standards that combined race and ethnicity together. So essentially, Hispanic or Latino was an ethnicity question that was separate from the race question. These proposed standards combined them and also proposed a new category in this combined race and ethnicity question, which was for Middle Eastern and North African. Despite overwhelming support through comments that were submitted to OMB via the Federal Register, the Trump administration chose not to pursue those standards in the 2020 census, and these standards remain a very high priority for a broad coalition of civil rights groups and researchers, including Asian American and Pacific Islander serving populations and groups. Next, when we look at different administrations, the Obama administration, in addition to the work of interagency efforts, such as what we saw with OMB, we saw significant advancements in the Department of Labor, in the Department of Health and Human Services, and particular data collections, such as the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander National Health Interview Survey, as well as moves by the Department of Education in terms of improving best practices as it pertains to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students. The Biden administration has built on those prior foundations and has really taken off on data equity in a very significant way. First, the Biden administration reestablished the White House Initiative, this time terming it not the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but terming it the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, reflecting important trends within our community to specifically lift up the unique circumstances of Native Hawaiians in the United States. The Biden administration also reestablished the Presidential Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Importantly, as Congresswoman Chu noted, the Biden administration, in its first day in office, established racial equity as one of its core priorities, and as part of it, established the Equitable Data Working Group under Ambassador Susan Rice and the Domestic Policy Council. The Equitable Data Working Group was co-chaired by the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Office of Management and Budget. And there are elements of that work, now that the report is out when it comes to implementation, that will be under OSTP, OMB, and other agencies. Importantly, the Biden administration's efforts were complemented and in some ways spurred on by efforts by the National Coalition of Asian Pacific Americans, its members, as well as allied researchers, who submitted a letter to the Domestic Policy Council in September 2021 with various recommendations that are also incorporated into our report. In terms of where our recommendations fit in with the Equitable Data Working Group, think of it as providing a roadmap of how we can make advancements on data equity. The report by the Equitable Data Working Group lays out a case on why we need to have equitable data and where these practices can have impact. Whereas our report focuses more on the how, given that our communities have been making the case for why we need to pursue data equity for decades, including from the 1970s. If we had to summarize the recommendations in our report with one phrase, it would be data disaggregation plus. Of course, data disaggregation remains the North Star for our communities when it comes to data equity, ensuring that we expand the kind of standards for data collection when it pertains to detailed origin groups in the Asian American racial category, as well as the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander racial category. But it does not stop there. Improving the standards and ensuring data collections to the most detailed level possible is critical, but we need to do more. Part of the recommendations from the NCAPA coalition letter that also included researchers was the call to create additional case studies that are specific to AA and NHPI communities, especially in light of the disproportionate effect of COVID-19 on particular populations, including Pacific Islander populations and particular occupation groups within the Asian American umbrella. Our report also calls for updating the federal minimum standard and expanding the categories for collection. We also call for the creation of pilot programs or otherwise incentivizing agencies to expand their current data collection categories beyond any newly created federal minimum standard. This also requires funding. Often these standards are created, but agencies do not have adequate budgets to ensure adequate funding to meet these new data equity standards and requirements. We also call for the Domestic Policy Council to commit to submitting an annual public report regarding federal agencies' data practices and progress that they are making towards the disaggregation of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander data. In addition, we call for the inclusion of community and scientific expert voices. We cannot do equity work without doing inclusion work. There is so much expertise within our communities when it comes to subject matter expertise, as well as population expertise. Often these are the most trusted messengers when it comes to our communities, and our community voices and scientific expert voices need to be included when it comes to the implementation work of data equity. In that vein, this report, in addition to the NCAPA Coalition letter, recommended the creation of a scientific advisory committee and a community advisory committee on data equity, similar to those that the US Census Bureau has pursued with respect to racial, ethnic, and other undercounted populations. Finally, our recommendations on disaggregation plus include prioritizing timeliness between the completion of data collection and reporting that data back to community members. This is a very important issue right now with the 2020 census, where disaggregated data from the census have not yet been released and will not look like they will not be released until August 2023. Our community organizations, researchers, as well as members of CAPAC have been pushing the Census Bureau to at least release some parts of that data, including population numbers at the state and national level, well prior to August of 2023. Finally, it's important to not only focus on data, but to also lift up community narrative in line with our framework of DNA, data, narrative, and action. And then after the dissemination and outreach phase associated with data products, to engage with community members in the cyclical process to make sure that when it comes to evaluation and changes to data criteria and data systems, when it comes to survey data as well as administrative data, that our community voices and researcher voices are at the table invited in the earliest possible stages so that we continue this process of continual improvement in the collection of data to advance data equity and equity for all of our communities. I will now turn it over to Howard Shi, who will present some of the findings from our demographic report that we are also releasing today. Howard, I can't see you, but if you're speaking, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Karthik. Sorry about that. Just needed to unmute myself. I just want to make sure we are the slide is. Can we advance the slide to the next one, please? Thank you. So I'm pleased to do a preview of our upcoming 2022 State of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in the United States report. It's going to look at some of the key demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of our communities, and be hopefully a tool that can be used by all of our friends here on this call, as well as advocates throughout the country. Next slide, please. So a quick preview of what the contents of the report is going to be. We're going to certainly look at the population change and growth using some of the limited 2020 data that's been already released, as well as bringing in American Community Survey data to look at detailed population growth. We also want to look at where the population is distributed across the country, as well as looking at the continued impact of immigration on our communities, and look at the undocumented population. We'll also look at educational attainment, as well as occupational differences, and cover poverty differences and homeownership differences that we see within the disaggregated data. Next slide, please. So I want to cover a couple of key terms. So the Census Bureau back in 2000 allowed for multiple race responses in the decennial census and also in other census surveys. So there's two different tabulations that the Census Bureau puts out. One they call the race group alone. This is when a respondent only identifies as a single category, and there are two levels, two tiers of categories. One, there's the major race categories, your Asian alone, or your Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander alone categories. So if you identify yourself as only Asian, it could be that you're just one Asian category, or you could be multiple Asian categories. You would fall under this tabulation. If you go down to the next level, where you're looking at detailed Asian or detailed Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander categories, when a respondent identifies as only that category, for example, Asian Indian alone, they would only be tabulated in the Asian Indian alone category. They would not be tabulated in other tabulations. The other category is race alone or in combination. This is where we want to include people who identify in whole or in part as a particular category. So this is a more expansive definition of community, and is also used in a lot of cases to highlight the growing dynamics within a community. So for
I think we'll need to speed this along because I don't know when Erica is going to be joining us. So I'm just going to.
Okay. All right, sure. So let's head to the next one then.
Yeah.
So the first one, it just takes a look at the growth that's happening, and we can see that Asians and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders remain some of the fastest growing communities. For this particular decennial census, American Indian and Alaskan Natives alone or in combination, the multiracial group has increased tremendously, and a lot has to do with a lot of individuals discovering that they identify as American Indian or Alaskan Native due to genealogy or DNA testing. Next slide. But when we look at Asian alone and exclude the multiracial categories, we see that Asians and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders are, again, the fastest growing parts of our country. Next slide. So we see here that this is a sampling of the different detailed Asian national origins groups. See that California is most prominently the number one state, but once you get past that, there's a lot of variety within our communities as to where populations are being established. And we have a full table with all the different categories in our report. Next slide. And then similarly for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander groups, we see Hawaii and California as the dominant positions. But we'll notice, the next state down, for example, if you look at the Marshallese, almost the same amount of Marshallese live in Arkansas as in Hawaii. So you have a lot of variety within that once you move down to the next tier. Next slide, please. So in terms of immigration, we see that the newest immigrant groups, the Nepalis and Bhutanese, who have a lot of diversity visas in the case of Nepalese community, and as well as refugee communities from Nepali-speaking Bhutanese, as well. You see a lot of immigration driving that growth, and a huge proportion of that population is foreign-born. And then at the other end, you see that Hmong are now majority native-born due to the changes in the immigration patterns, as well as natural population increases. Next slide, please. And then within the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, you have the confluence of the different statuses that different groups have. Like the Chamorro community are largely citizens and are able to come to the United States without having to deal with immigration policy. And then you have Samoans who are considered U.S. nationals and still have to naturalize, but have a faster process. And then you have non-immigrant Pacific Islander groups like the Marshallese, who are free to enter the United States, but have challenges in terms of getting benefits and citizenship. So you see that there is a lot of there's a lot of classification of different Pacific Islander groups as largely immigrant, just due to the nature of the relationships that they have with the United States. Next slide, please. And then we see this slide we included. We wanted to show that earlier in this decade, the olive green is the Asian countries. They were driving the LPR admissions into the country. What has happened in the latter half of the decade is that a lot of the Trump era attacks on immigration really reduced the number of people wanting to come to the United States from Asian countries and applying for the LPR status. And then we see COVID really kicking down the LPR applications at the end there. Next slide, please. We also wanted to report on some of the modeling that different groups have been doing to estimate the size of the unauthorized population. These are the most recent numbers from the Center for Migration Studies, showing that the estimated unauthorized population is down a little bit. It was maybe a couple of years ago at 11.4 million. But the Asian numbers are fairly steady at 1.7 and represent about close to 17% of the unauthorized population in the United States. Next slide, please. And then we wanted to look at educational attainment. I mean, the classic story of the model minority is that Asians are have college degrees, overeducated like me. But if you look at the different groups and you disaggregate, you see that there's a lot of challenges, particularly the refugee communities, where more often than not, educational opportunities and were interrupted by the refugee experience. And so you see Burmese and Cambodian, Laotian, Bhutanese, all are down there with lower educational attainment. And so those are the groups that we need to figure out how we can help build economic opportunity for. Next slide. Similarly, for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, we see that the Marshallese population has really low educational attainment, but for the other Pacific Islander groups, they're fairly close together in terms of both college degrees as well as high school graduation. In fact, the Native Hawaiian population probably has the highest high school graduation rate, even compared to a lot of Asian groups. Next slide, please. So this is the educational attainment obviously gets reflected into the occupational opportunities that are made available to the population. So you see that you have a lot of groups that are like the Thai and the Vietnamese who are highly dependent on service occupations, but you also see the refugee communities. They are really highly dependent on production and transportation and material moving occupations. So you see Burmese with almost 44% of the workforce devoted to that category, and Laotians at 34%, and Bhutanese at, I'm trying to read that, 40%. So you see a lot of variation within the different groups. It's largely driven by educational and economic opportunity. Next slide, please. And then we also see similarly for the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. We noted before that Marshallese had really low educational attainment, and a lot of them are in the production and transportation and material moving occupations. And one of the reasons why that the Marshallese are settling in Arkansas because of the job opportunities that are there for their community. And then we see the Fijians, who are really had a high college graduation rates, and therefore have some of the highest proportion of their workforce in management and professional occupations. Next slide. So again, with jobs come income and federal poverty rates. So we see that the Burmese and Mongolian, Bangladeshis have really high poverty rates, and then the Filipinos and Asian Indians who are in the higher paying occupations have much lower poverty rates. Next slide. And then similarly for NHPI, national origin categories, Marshallese we've already seen are in those blue collar jobs with lower educational levels, and therefore they have higher poverty rates. Next slide. And then we see home ownership rates. Again, this is a lot tied to income. So you see that the Taiwanese at the bottom, who have some of the highest rates for both education and income and job opportunities, have some of the highest home ownership rates, and they're actually on par with white Americans, while the rest of most of the Asian community are slightly below the level of white Americans. And then we see the lower income categories are much more likely to be renters than homeowners. Next slide. And then we see again, the Marshallese population, almost all of them are renters, largely driven by income and job opportunities. Next slide. I guess that's so that concludes. We have a few more other sections that we weren't able to cover today, but we look forward to sharing it with you later this afternoon. I'll turn it back over to Karthik.
Great. Thank you, Howard. Thank you for pointing that out. I'll just say a couple of things. In addition to kind of hostile environment for immigrants under the Trump administration, you also saw a significant slowdown in the processing of legal permanent resident and naturalization applications. And that's something that is an area of concern, and we need to be thinking about what we can do to help accelerate and catch up to what what should have been the case in terms of people that were waiting in line and got significantly delayed in terms of their applications for LPR, legal permanent resident status, as well as citizenship status in the United States. There's a lot more, folks, that you'll see in our report that we'll be releasing later on today. And sometimes the results are a bit surprising. You might have noticed for Vietnamese Americans, for example, relatively high rates of home ownership, higher than one might expect given other aspects of socioeconomic disadvantage. And as Howard noted, we think of Japanese Americans as the quintessential native-born Asian American detailed origin group, but the Hmong population is even more native-born than the Japanese American population. That has everything to do with the particularities of the Hmong refugee experience, as well as natural growth in the United States, as Howard noted. We thank you, Howard, for presenting that information. I'm now going to ask Erica Moritsugu from the White House to join us. We know that this has been a huge priority for the administration, but Erica, I know even for you personally in your various roles that you have played in the federal government. Welcome to the launch of our report, and would love to hear your thoughts and reactions, especially to our data equity recommendations, building on those issued by the Equitable Data Working Group.
Yeah, thank you, Karthik. Aloha, y'all. I'm Erica Moritsugu. I'm Deputy Assistant to the President, and I serve as the White House's Senior Liaison to the Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. And I'm a member of the President's senior staff acting as the voice in the West Wing to lift up the hopes and needs of our AANHPI communities and all of our administration's policies and community engagement and outreach. It's a new role that I was selected for in April of last year, and it's been my honor to execute and build on and expand upon the President and Vice President's longstanding commitment to our communities. And here, I'm charged with making sure that the richness and diversity of our communities are not made invisible, and that the impacts of the administration policies are inclusive of, informed by, and communicated to our communities. This obviously includes the importance of disaggregated data. So I appreciate the opportunity to join you for the launch of this outstanding project. As you may know, Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are some of the fastest growing racial and ethnic groups in the nation. The Asian American community has increased by more than 35% over the last decade. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are the third fastest growing population. And as the Data Equity Report notes, the US Census Bureau projects that the majority of the American population by 2045 will be people of color. By 2030, immigration will become the primary source of population growth in the United States, and many will come from Asian and Pacific Island nations and territories. This means that we need accurate and accessible data on AANHPIs to lift up the needs and experiences of our communities. That's why disaggregating data is so important. You know that we're not a monolith of people. You've heard our other speakers talk about that. Our communities are comprised of individuals tracing roots from more than 20 countries with our own unique experiences and needs and challenges and contributions, and over 800 spoken languages and dialects between us. It's this diversity that makes us so rich and vibrant. And yet, this diversity in our racial groups is often poorly reflected in data. And why does this matter? It matters because to make good policy, we need good data. The consequence of having poor data on Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders is that it perpetuates generalizations that we're trying to overcome. For example, the model minority myth, the notion that virtually all of AANHPIs are self-sufficient, well-educated, and upwardly mobile. We know that that's not the case. Such generalizations mask the diversity within the AANHPI communities, painting a blanket picture over the differences in our socioeconomic statuses, educational attainment, health equity, economic attainment, and all other areas. This is why the launch of this report series is so important. The pool of publicly available information on past activities and current plans to advance data equity for AANHPIs at the federal level offers us a snapshot of the state of data equity at the federal level. This matters because disaggregated data can help us target resources where they're most needed, in colleges that enroll a large percentage of low-income AANHPI students, in communities where many AANHPIs live below the poverty line, and in health centers that address health issues that disproportionately affect our communities. AANHPI data has been a champion in advancing data equity for AANHPIs, and I'm personally and professionally excited for this series of reports. I'd like to thank the entire AANHPI data team for putting this important program together, with a special shout out to Karthik and Harji, who moved backstage. I'd also like to thank our colleagues for their leadership from the National Coalition of Asian Pacific Americans and the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus for their leadership in this and many, many other spaces. Mahalo for the opportunity to share this space with you.
Thank you so much, Erica. And I know that especially in a month like this, there's a lot going on. We really appreciate you not only taking the time to be here, but it's very clear that Erica has read our draft report and was citing some key passages from that report. So grateful for your partnership and leadership within our community. Thank you. Next, I'd like to invite on stage Greg Odon from the National Coalition of Asian Pacific Americans. Known Greg for about a decade now, and I know, and has just been such a strong champion personally, but also through the National Coalition of Asian Pacific Americans, who have also been strong allies in this work. Greg, welcome, and would love to get a little bit of additional context from you in terms of NCAPA, the way that it's been engaging not only the Biden administration, but prior administrations, and what you are hopeful in terms of the path forward.
Thanks, Karthik, and certainly thank you to API Data's team for the partnership on this joint report. It is certainly an exciting moment. Thank you to the Biden administration, Erica, your colleagues at OMB, OSDP, and all of your staff across the federal government who helped drive us to this point. We're more open to talking about data equity, and it's really given us this opportunity to move this conversation forward. For NCAPA, as the umbrella coalition of 38 of the largest Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander national organizations, the coalition was founded on the idea that our community's diversity was its greatest strength, and a unified voice at the national level was necessary to fight for the structural change our community needed. Our members are leading organizations in immigration, health, housing, and education. Our members lead in the East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities as well. This report marks an important benchmark in longstanding work that has spanned decades. And the simple truth is that the progress that has been made is a direct reflection of the work community leaders seated before us, past administrations, including the Obama administration, and now with this commitment made by President Joe Biden and his administration. Last summer, NCAPA leaders were fortunate enough to sit across from President Biden and Vice President Harris at the White House to raise up issues impacting our community. We made the case that data disaggregation across the federal government was an opportunity to fundamentally advance how AANHPI communities were understood and ultimately impacted by the federal government. As Erica said, good data is necessary for good public policy. Advocates need good data to make their case, to point out where the system is failing, and to inform changes. If data is the invitation that gets you invited to the table, for our communities, our invitation has been lost in the mail, hasn't arrived, or hasn't even been printed. To finally be able to tell the diverse narratives of our community, to shine light on the lived experiences of millions of AANHPIs who have been given more examples of how government fails to account for them rather than uplift them, this is a watershed moment. You cannot achieve racial equity without data equity. I'll close in saying this. I'm incredibly proud of the NCAPA member organizations who not only contributed to this joint report, but also whose labor brought us to this point. More and more federal agencies are going to engage on this subject, and the report issued by the Equitable Data Working Group referenced earlier, it really gives us a path to accomplish this. We fully understand that the work's not done, but if the last few years have taught us anything, it is to appreciate every victory, no matter how small. This joint report is not the finish line, but it will be an important measuring stick to ensure that we stay accountable towards crossing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. So we'll wait for any additional questions that might come in from our audience. But in the meantime, I want to ask if you can say a bit more, right, in terms of, tomorrow, for example, we'll have several NCAPA coalition members who've been fighting for data equity as essential for racial equity for decades now, including CRAC, for example, EPIC, the Health Forum. So I'm wondering if you have, close to 40 coalition members. I'm not asking you to pick any favorites among them, but if you can give us a sense of the kinds of issues that that these communities are confronting and why data equity is so essential for successfully addressing those barriers and challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Karthik. I think that's exactly right. Data equity, data disaggregation represents one of those cross-cutting issues for the entire community, that it doesn't matter if you're talking about health equity or educational outcomes or economic development. Disaggregating that data impacts everyone. And so every single member of NCAPA, almost all 38 members, work on this issue, right? And as I mentioned earlier, they're coming at it from different angles, and they've done research, they've done engagement with different agencies, they've worked with members of Congress. And really, when you get down to it, depending on the policy area, that shared narrative of needing to understand fully the lived experiences of different parts of our community is essential. And so fighting for that for decades has been really important for our organizations. And quite honestly, like I said, we wouldn't be here today without their work. The report we referenced, the recommendations we've made to the Biden administration are all a reflection of longstanding work.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg. We will wait for another minute to see if there are any questions. You can feel free to tweet at us or type them in the comments feature of YouTube. And if not, we will close this part of our program. But I'm just going to wait another few seconds. But the final question I'll push to you, Greg, is, in terms of what the ideal would look like to you and to NCAPA member organizations, when it comes to not only disaggregating the data, but the timeliness of giving the data back, of recognizing the expertise of community. What would success look like to you, or what should federal agencies be thinking about as part of this disaggregation plus agenda that we're laying out?
Yeah, I think it starts with just visibility of our communities. I've been working in or around the federal government for a while, and as Congresswoman Chu mentioned, you see a lot of times where federal data comes out and reports come out, and our communities are completely absent. There needs to be a paradigm shift within the federal government that when we're talking about communities of color, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders are included. Fundamentally, we are there. We are part of that baseline calculus that every agency does when they're doing program assessment or thinking about outreach to our communities. And so I think success for us really looks like certainly updating the OMB standard. I think it starts there, but seeing the funding that's necessary to really implement this across the federal government, it's going to cost money, but change oftentimes does. And the change that we'll see, the impact that it will have, and ultimately the way it will fundamentally change lives for people in our community is important. And so our hope is that we see simultaneously this updating of the standard, but also a commitment from the Biden administration in their budgets to really see this through.
Well, in some ways, isn't it a happy coincidence, Greg, that it's the Office of Management and Budget that sets the standards, but that also helps develop the federal budget. So hopefully what we will see in future budgets is that prioritization, as you note. And sometimes it's those early seed investments that'll be so critical to ensure that we're well on our path to data equity as well as equity more broadly. Well, I don't see any additional questions in the chat. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. We will have those reports up by the end of business today on aapidata.com. And we should also be able to cross-reference that from the National Coalition of Asian Pacific Americans website, which is ncapaonline.org. Thank you again for joining us. Happy Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month.